am overwhelmed by sadness this week. The news about our 3 Israeli boys, Eyal, Gilad, and Naphtali, the horrific loss of Muhammad, also one of our children, a child of Jerusalem and of humanity, the mounting evidence that young Jewish people perpetrated that crime, rockets raining down on Israel, the death and destruction in Gaza, the noise, the fire, the earth-shattering anguish experienced by children on both sides. Sad is my predominant emotion. My next one is a sense of anger and confusion. We look so hard to find God, to see God, to hear God, and amidst all this violence and chaos, how is that even possible? I found it hard to turn to the Torah this week for guidance. For in the Torah this week, we have an apparent glorification of Pinchas, the overzealous priest who murders 2 people because he has judged them to be weak and heretical. Pinchas's actions, his extremist temperament, those are good. I cannot accept this. Not before this week, and certainly not as it comes to a close. But where I found a bit more comfort is in our Haftorah portion. The section that Maddie and Jake will read tomorrow, it also tells of one who is overwhelmed with zeal for God. But this man has a different experience, learns a deeper lesson, and has a greater legacy than I believe Pinchas ever will. This week's prophetic reading comes from 1 Kings, and it contains the story of Elijah, the prophet who will herald in the age of redemption. That's why we wait for him on Passover, so he can tell us the world will be free. He hasn't shown up yet, at least to my Seder, but the fact that it is he for whom we wait and open the door, that it is he who will understand the coming of the Messianic age first, this tells us that we might look more deeply at his story. What does he know that we do not know? What can we learn from him? The story in brief goes like this. Elijah is moved by zeal for God and destroys idols and people in what he sees as his service to God. He believes he is doing God's work, but he must flee the king and queen's wrath, for they seek revenge on him for the deeds that he has performed. He then finds himself alone, scared and threatened, and he begins to lose faith. He hides isolated in a cave, afraid for his life. In fact, he would like to forfeit it, just to end the loneliness and the hopelessness that he feels. And there, in that dark place, God speaks to him. Elijah is told to come out of the cave and stand before God. The book of Kings continues, and lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks before God. But God was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a soft murmuring sound. Or another translation, famous one, a still small voice. And this passage concludes, when Elijah heard it, when Elijah heard the soft murmuring sound, when he heard the still small voice, he knew God was there. There are plenty of loud noises in this week's Torah prophetic reading. Elijah's righteous indignation is loud and bold. The ear-splitting wind, the fearful earthquake, the voracious fire, and yet the text makes sure to tell us that God is not in those things. God is in the kol dmama daka, the still small voice, a quiet presence. And somehow Elijah was able to listen closely enough to hear it. That is the miracle. How might this speak to us? There have been plenty of loud noises over the last 2 weeks. Things that split our ears, burn our eyes, shake our foundation. We fear for our loved ones in Israel, for our Jewish homeland. We fear for the innocent people in Gaza, for children everywhere whose lives are forever changed by these days. The wind, the earthquake, the fire, they are before us, upon us, but we must listen harder if we are to find hope, as Elijah did. Here are the places where we may hear a kol dmama daka, a still small voice, the quiet presence of God. The Arab and Israeli parents who lost their children in recent days have every human reason never to look one another in the eye again, to harbor so much anger that it turns to hate, to want nothing more than to destroy anyone who shares any piece of an identity with those who took their children away. But even amidst that anger, a phone call from Naftali Frankel's family to Muhammad Abu Khader's family, Palestinian visitors to a Jewish house of mourning, a busload of religious Jews entering the Khader household to offer gifts and condolences. None of these gestures easily offered, easily accepted. And they didn't drown out the wind and the fire and the earthquake, but neither were they drowned out by them. A kol dmama daka amidst the strong winds of hate and fear. Children on both sides of the conflict are living in fear and amidst trauma. A reporter interviewed some of these children. The reporter asks an Israeli child, "When you're here feeling scared, do you ever think of the kids over there who might feel scared too?" "Yes," he answers, this 10-year-old. "My mother told me there were sirens there too, and those kids have to run away, and I think of them." "We feel so scared," a 10-year-old child living in Gaza City said. "They terrify us." But when the reporter asks, "Do you want their kids to die too?" the answer from the 10-year-old Palestinian boy comes back, "No, they are like me. They have rights. They shouldn't die. They should be protected, just like we should be protected." Children who, even in the midst of violence, have not yet learned to hate. They still see the humanity of their counterparts and have space in their hearts for them. Kol dmama daka, amidst the strong quakes of bombs and rockets and fear. We look at Avital and Maddie and Jake, at the beautiful young people in our congregation who recognize within themselves the potential to lead. They are willing to stand up and say, "Hineni, here I am. I have something to give to my family, to my people, to the world." Their voices are not loud. The world is on fire, and the flames of it, our loud adult voices too, can easily drown these children out. But here tonight, we know that they are there, and we can hear them. Kol dmama daka, God's still small voice, telling us that there can be a future that looks different, brighter than today. Just like Elijah, in the midst of sadness, his frustration, his loss of center, we have to pause and listen hard to hear the quiet presence of God. If we don't listen for it, we will only hear the loud, the mighty, the powerful. And we've been told that God does not always dwell in those big, loud things. Elijah's legacy is one of being able to tell when redemption is coming, when peace is coming. And perhaps that is because he is such a good listener. On this night, as sirens wail in our homeland and suffering abounds, let us model ourselves after Elijah and try to hear the soft murmuring sound that lets us know God dwells within each of us. Let us be the best listeners we can be. Perhaps that is our greatest task. And just as we said these words earlier in the service led by Avital, we can remind ourselves of them also as we leave. The central prayer of Judaism, Shema Yisrael. Listen, people of Israel. Listen for the kol dmama daka. Shabbat shalom.